There's a stretch of dry country where the wind doesn't blow so much as breathe, slow, hot, like something old and tired leaning over your shoulder. I spent 40 years on that land, and I thought I'd seen every kind of thirst a body could carry. I was wrong. I saw a boy once. Couldn't have been more than 8. He was walking a line straight as a fence post toward my well, and he was carrying 2 clay jars strapped across his back that were bigger than he was, and his lips had cracked open in 3 places, and he did not stop walking even when he saw my rifle. 2 miles, that's how far he'd come. 2 miles each way in heat that killed cattle, so his grandmother and his baby sister wouldn't die in the shade of a rock. I want to tell you what that boy did to me. Not what I did for him. People always get that part backward. What he did. Because I was a hard man before that summer, and I want you to understand exactly how hard, so you'll believe me when I tell you what was left of that hardness by the time the rains came. Stay with me. This one doesn't let go easy. The first time I saw him, I nearly shot him. I want that on the record plain before I say another word, because if I start soft, you won't trust the rest of it, and this whole thing lives or dies on you trusting me. I was standing at the corner of the horse corral with my Winchester already half up, thumb on the hammer, because something was moving through the Ocotillo down by the wash, and in that summer anything moving meant trouble. Cattle thieves, Comancheros. Men gone strange from the heat. The drought had turned decent folks into scavengers and turned scavengers into worse, and I'd buried 2 neighbors already that season, one of them face down in his own dry stock tank with his boots still on. So when the Ocotillo moved, my rifle came up. That's just the truth of the man I was. Then the shape came clear of the brush, and it was small. Wrong small. It didn't move like a man crouching. It moved like something exhausted trying to remember how to walk. I let the barrel drop maybe 6 inches. Not all the way, 6 inches. It was a boy. He came up out of the wash slow, 1 foot and then the other, and the sun was doing that thing it did in July where the whole world went white at the edges, so at first he was just a dark smear against all that light. But as he closed the distance I could make out the shape of him, thin, brown-skinned, black hair chopped rough and stuck flat to his skull with old sweat. Apache. No question. I'd lived on the edge of that country long enough to know the difference in how a person held themselves, and this child held himself like the land had made him, straight-backed, even half-dead. And on his back, lashed with rawhide and a length of what looked like woven yucca cord, he carried 2 clay water jars. They were enormous. That's the thing I keep coming back to all these years later when I try to explain it to people who weren't there. Those jars were enormous. Each one would have come up to my knee, round-bellied ollas the kind the Apache women made, and lined with piñon pitch so they'd hold water without weeping it all out. Empty, one of them was probably a decent load for a grown woman. He had 2. And he was carrying them up out of a wash in 99-degree heat, with the patience of a mule, and the face of a boy who has decided something and will not be talked out of it. I lowered the rifle the rest of the way. He stopped about 30 feet off, close enough that I could see his eyes had gone to the well behind me, the good well, the deep one my father dug back when this valley still had grass, the one that hadn't gone dry even in this year of dying. And then his eyes came back to me and just stayed there, flat and level and waiting. He didn't beg. I want you to understand that too. Later on, people who heard the story always assumed the child begged, cried, went to his knees. He never did any of that, not once, not on the worst day of it. He stood there with his cracked lips pressed shut, and he looked at me, and he waited to find out what kind of man I was. I found out too, same as him at the same time. Water, I said, stupid, like he didn't know why he'd come. Like there was any other reason a person walked out of that dead country toward the one wet hole in 20 miles. He didn't answer. I don't think he had English, or if he did, he was saving it. He shifted his weight, and one of the jars knocked against the other with a hollow clay sound, and I saw him wince. Not at the sound, at the movement, because the rawhide had worn a raw stripe across both his shoulders where it crossed, and the skin there was rubbed down past pink into something that would scar. I looked at that stripe on his shoulders for a long moment. Then I set the rifle down against the corral rail and I said, "Come on then." Now, I've told this part of it plenty of times over the years, and I've noticed people like it. They like the picture of the hard rancher softening at the sight of a suffering child. It flatters something in them, and I suppose it flatters something in me too, telling it. But I'm going to be honest with you the way I try to be honest with myself when I can't sleep, which is more nights than not these days. I didn't let him at the well because my heart broke. I let him at the well because I was curious. Because in all that summer of death and dust and men gone mean, here was something I couldn't account for a boy carrying 200 pounds of water 2 miles across killing ground alone. And I have always, my whole life, been the kind of man who has to know how a thing works before I can leave it be. My wife, God rest her, used to say I'd take apart a working clock just to be sure it deserved to keep running. She said it like a complaint. She wasn't wrong. So I'll tell you my quirk, since we're going to be together a while and you might as well know it. I whittle, always have. Little animals, mostly a horse the size of your thumb, a coyote, a jackrabbit with its ears laid back. I've got a good knife and a chunk of soft cottonwood in my pocket most days, and when I'm working a thing out in my head, my hands go to it without asking me. My wife said I never looked a man in the eye and told the truth so well as when I was pretending to watch my own knife. Maybe that's so. I had the cottonwood in my hand that whole first afternoon. I remember turning it, not cutting yet, just holding it while I watched the boy. He didn't rush the well. That surprised me. A thirsty animal will kill itself at water, drink till it founders. But the boy unslung those 2 great jars off his back, careful, so careful, kneeling and letting them down onto the packed dirt like they were sleeping children. And only then did he go to the trough where the overflow ran, and he cupped his own 2 hands and drank, and even then he drank slow. Small mouthfuls, rested, drank again. He was rationing himself. At 8 years old, at the edge of collapse, he had the discipline to ration his own body so he wouldn't sick up the water and waste it. Somebody had taught him that, or thirst had. I've never been sure which is worse to think about. I hauled the bucket and filled his jars myself. He watched me do it with those flat waiting eyes, and I felt them on my hands the whole time, and I found, this is a strange thing to admit, I found I wanted to do it right. Didn't want to spill. Didn't want this child watching me waste even a cupful of the thing he'd nearly killed himself to reach. I topped both ollas to the lip and pitched the wet rope of the pitch seal so they wouldn't slop over on his back. And when I was done, I stood up and my knees cracked and I said, "That's a hell of a load, son. Where's your people?" He looked at me a while longer, then he pointed. West and a little north, off toward the broken country where the mountains came down in red steps, and a man could hide a whole nation in the folds of it if he had to. Which the Apache had had to, that year and every year, and I knew it. And something in me went cold and old and ashamed. Because I knew everybody in that valley knew why an Apache family was hidden out in the dry rocks instead of down along the living water where their grandmothers had camped. They were hiding from us, from men like me, from men exactly like the man I'd been at the corner of that corral with my rifle coming up. "How many of you out there?" I asked. He held up 3 fingers. Then after a moment he folded one down, 2. Then, and this is the part that got under my skin and stayed there, he touched his own chest and held up 3 again. 3, counting himself, an old one and a small one and him. Grandmother, baby boy, he was the water for all 3. I did the arithmetic without wanting to. 2 miles out, 2 miles back, now uphill and loaded. In this heat a grown man wouldn't make it once a day without a horse. And those 2 jars, full, that was maybe 3-4 days of water for 3 people if they were careful, and everything about this boy told me they were careful past the edge of what careful should have to be. Which meant he'd be back, 3 days, 4 at the outside. I stood there in the white heat with my useless cottonwood in my hand, and I watched an 8-year-old boy lash 200 pounds of my well water back across his rub-draw shoulders, and I did not offer him my horse, and I did not offer to carry it, and I did not walk him home. I want you to sit with that because I've had to. I let that child pick up that killing load and start back across 2 miles of dying country alone, and I stood at my corral and watched him go until the white light swallowed him. And then I went inside my cool adobe house, and I sat down at my own table, and I could not, for the life of me, remember why I hadn't helped. Fear, partly. If I rode out to an Apache camp and the wrong men saw me do it, I'd have been called worse than a fool. There were men in that valley, Harlan Voss and his crowd mostly, who'd have shot the boy on sight and me right after for the crime of watering him. That was real. I'm not making excuses, I'm telling you the shape of the trap I was standing in. But it was more than fear. It was that I hadn't yet let it be more than curiosity. I'd let him at the well the way you'd let a strange dog eat off your porch, interested, a little moved, but keeping the fence up between us. He was a puzzle to me still, not a person. And a man can watch a puzzle walk off into the heat carrying 200 pounds of water and only feel a mild, itching regret. like a splinter he means to get to later. I got to it later, believe me. I got to it in the middle of the night most nights for the rest of my life. That first evening I sat at my table and I whittled. Cut into the cottonwood at last, and my hands made a shape without me choosing it, and when I looked down I'd started carving a jar. A round-bellied olla the size of my thumb. I set it down like it had burned me. He came back 4 days later. I was ready that time, not with the rifle, with a thing I'd worked out. I'd taken an old wooden yoke, the kind we used for carrying water buckets balanced on the shoulders, and I'd padded the neck of it with sheepskin and rigged it so a small body could sling those 2 jars off a bar across the back instead of grinding them straight against raw skin. Spent 2 evenings on it. Told myself it was a practical thing. Told myself a man doesn't like to see good water jars cracked because they're carried stupid. Told myself all kinds of things. He came up out of the wash the same way, straight-backed, flat-eyed, patient. And when he saw me standing there at the well with the padded yoke in my hands, he stopped, and for the first time something moved in his face. Not trust, I want to be careful with this. It wasn't trust, trust would have been a lie and he was too smart a child to spend a lie on a stranger with a well. But it was attention, a recalculating. He looked at the yoke, and he looked at me, and I watched him understand what it was for, and I watched him understand that I'd made it since the last time, which meant I'd thought about him after he left, which meant I was a different kind of thing than the rifle at the corral had suggested. Try it, I said, and held it out. He didn't take it, not right off. He set his jars down first, careful as ever, and drank his slow, small mouthfuls, and only when he'd rested did he come and let me fit the yoke across his shoulders, and I saw him test the weight of it empty, shifting side to side, and I saw the exact moment his body understood that this would not grind the raw stripe deeper. His shoulders came down a half-inch. That's all. A half-inch of a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten. It was a choice to hold it. He looked up at me. "Donna," he said. It took me a second. Then I understood he'd told me his name. I put my hand flat on my own chest, the way he had, and I said my name, which I'll keep to myself here because it doesn't matter and this isn't about me, though God knows I've spent enough of this story insisting it isn't about me. He repeated it back. Got it wrong. Got it wrong in a way that was better than the right way, softer, and I never once corrected him. For 2 years after that he called me by that soft, wrong name, and I answered to it faster than I'd ever answered to my own. That's how it started. A boy a well a padded yoke, 2 wrong-said names. I filled his jars, he drank. I gave him, and this is the first thing I ever gave him that I didn't dress up in some practical excuse, a strip of dried beef and a lump of hard sugar, and I watched him not eat them. He put them inside his shirt, for the old one and the small one. He would not eat in front of me when there were 2 mouths at home that hadn't. I have known grown men, church-going men, men who prayed loud, who could not have done that, and this boy did it without a flicker, like it wasn't even a decision, like the alternative was simply not a thing that existed in his world. I said before that I led him at the well out of curiosity and not a broken heart, and that was true of the first day. I'm telling you now that it stopped being true on the 4th day, in the space of about 10 seconds, watching a starving child put food away for his grandmother. Something in my chest that had been shut a long time, since my wife, since the fever winter, since a lot of things I won't go into, something in there gave way, quiet, like a bank of dry earth sliding into a wash. No sound to it, but afterward the shape of the country was different. "Donna," I said. He looked up. I pointed at the western hills, at the red, broken country where his people were hiding from mine. "Next time," I said, slow, hoping he'd get enough of it, "I'll come. I'll bring the mule, carry it for you." He understood more than I expected. His face closed up immediately, not angry, protecting. He shook his head, one small hard shake, and I understood that too, and I felt the shame of it come up my neck like a sunburn. He shook his head because a white man riding into their camp was not a mercy. It was a risk. It was the thing his grandmother had spent her whole life keeping him and the baby away from. And here I was offering it like a gift, too dense to see that the gift was a loaded gun. So I didn't ride out, not then. I did the next thing, which was the only true thing I had the sense to do that whole first month. I made the water easy. I fixed the trough so the overflow ran cleaner. I set out the yoke where he could always find it, on a peg by the well, so he never had to ask. I left the beef and the sugar where he'd see it. I made my well a safe place for a boy to come to, and I made it clear with everything but words that he could come as often as he needed and I'd ask nothing back. And then I let him keep his distance, which was the hardest and the most loving thing, though I didn't have the word love in my head about it yet. That came later, too. He came every 4 days, near enough to set a clock by, sometimes 3. Once in the worst stretch of August, when the sky went the color of a bruise and stayed that way for a week and it still would not rain, he came in too. And he came in a bad way, wobbling, and I made him sit in the shade of the well house a full hour before I'd let him load up. And he sat there furious with me for wasting his daylight, and I sat there furious with the whole cracked sky. And we were, I think, for that hour, something close to family. 2 people angry at the same thing, sitting in the same shade. I started learning him, bit by bit. He was quick, quicker than any child I'd known, quick in the way of somebody who'd never once been allowed to be slow. He had a scar on his left forearm, old white, that he never explained and I never asked about. He whistled sometimes, low, working the jars, a little 5-note thing that I found myself whistling back at the cattle for months afterward without meaning to. He hated waste. Hated it with a passion that went past thrift into something almost holy. If I spilled water hauling the bucket, he'd make a sound in his throat. A disapproving. And I got so I hauled that bucket for a scrawny Apache boy with more care than I'd ever hauled it for myself. And he loved that baby sister, that I learned slow from the shape of everything he did, because he never said one word to me about her the whole first month. But every scrap of food went inside his shirt. Every ounce of the water was for her and the old one first. He was at 8 entirely spent in the service of 2 other people, and he did not appear to find this remarkable or hard or unfair. It was simply the arrangement of his life. He was the water. He carried it. That was all. The first time I ever saw him come close to breaking wasn't over his own suffering. It was over hers. It was the last week of August. He came in late, wrong, off his 4-day rhythm by half a day, and coming fast, which he never did, half running up out of the wash with the empty jars banging on his back, and I was up off the corral rail before I'd even thought about it. His face, when he came clear of the light, his face was open. All the way open. Every wall in it down. And a child's face with all its walls down, when that child has kept them up through drought and fear and killing labor without a crack, is one of the worst things a man can look at, because you understand at once that whatever knocked those walls flat must be very, very bad. He got to me and he grabbed my sleeve, the first time he'd ever touched me, and he said a word, an Apache word. And then when I didn't understand, he said, cracking, "Sister. Sister." And he pointed back the way he'd come, back toward the red hills, and I understood that the baby was dying, or he thought she was, and that he'd run 4 miles in the heat on the strength of a single idea, the same idea that had brought him to my well the first day and every day since, which was that somewhere out beyond his own strength there might be one more thing he could carry back to keep his family alive. I saddled the mule before my head had finished arguing with me. That's the honest order of it. My hands were already throwing the pack frame over old Gideon. That was the mule, a mean gray brute I'd named for a preacher I'd disliked. My hands were cinching the girth and lashing on 2 full water skins, and the little cedar box where I kept needle, thread, laudanum, and the few doctoring things a man out that far learns to hoard. And while my hands did all that, my head stood off to one side saying, in my dead wife's voice as it always did when it wanted me to listen, "You know where this road goes. You ride out to an Apache camp in daylight, and if Voss's men catch you at it, they don't ask what you were doing there. They just decide." I knew it the way you know a stove is hot without touching it. I went anyway, and I'd like to tell you it was pure goodness that put me on that mule, but I've promised you the truth in this telling, so here it is. Part of what put me on that mule was the boy's hand still gripping my sleeve. He hadn't let go. Through the whole saddling, he'd stood there with his small brown fingers wound into my shirt like a man holding a rope over a drop. And I understood that if I shook him off, if I said, "No, son, I can't. It's too much risk," I would be shaking off the one true thing that had happened to me in a year of dust and dying. And I was too old and too lonely and too far gone to do that. So the goodness and the loneliness rode out together, both on the same mule, and I've never been able to fully separate them since. "Show me," I said. Donna climbed up behind the pack frame, light as a bird, God. He weighed nothing, all that carrying and the boy himself weighed nothing, and he pointed west, and we went. The country between my well and his people's hiding place was worse than I'd pictured, and I'd pictured it bad. First there was the wash, deep-cut and loose-bottomed, where every step Gideon took slid back a half step in the sand, and I thought about the boy crossing this loaded, 4 times a week, and I had to look at the horizon a while. Then the wash gave out into a flat of cracked hardpan that threw the heat back up at you so your face cooked from below as well as above. Then the broken country started for real. Red rock in steps and shelves, pinyon and juniper gone gray and brittle, dry as tinder, the whole slope one dropped match from burning. There was no trail I could see. Donna guided me by touches, a hand on my right shoulder for right, left for left, a small flat press between my shoulder blades for straight. Keep on, and he never once made a wrong call, and I understood I was being led by a child who had memorized this killing ground so completely that he could walk it half dead in the dark. Because he'd had to, because his family's lives were the fee for getting it wrong. We climbed for the better part of an hour. The sun sat on us the whole way like a hand pressing a thumb into the back of your neck. I smelled the camp before I saw it. Wood smoke thin, a very small fire, someone being careful, and under it something sourer, sicker, the smell that hangs around a body that isn't fighting off its trouble anymore. I knew that smell. I'd smelled it in my own house one winter, and I'd smell it in my sleep till I die. The boy's hand went tight on my shoulder, and I felt him lean, urging Gideon faster than Gideon meant to go, and then we came around a red shoulder of rock into a little hollow, half cave, half overhang, and there they were. An old woman, a baby, and nothing else in the whole world but rock and the two of them and a fire the size of my two hands. The grandmother came up onto her feet when she saw me. Faster than her body wanted to, I could see the cost of it, and she put herself between me and the small shape wrapped in a blanket on the ground, and her hand came up with a knife in it. Old worn, a trade knife with the bone handle gone smooth and dark from years of a palm. She held it low and steady, and she looked at me the way you'd look at a wolf that had walked into your camp, and she said something to Donna, low and hard and fast, and I did not need the words. What have you brought? What have you done? Why is he here? I sat very still on the mule with my hands where she could see them. I have thought a great deal in the years since about that old woman standing up with her knife. Everybody wants the Apache in a story like this to be either a devil or a saint, and she was neither. She was a person, an old, tired, terrified person who had buried more of her family than I will ever know about, and who had exactly one grandson and one great-granddaughter left in the entire world. And here was a white man riding into the last hidden place she had, and every white man she'd ever known had cost her something she couldn't get back. Her standing up with that knife wasn't hostility. It was arithmetic. It was love doing the only sum it knew how to do. Donna slid down off the mule and went to her and took hold of her knife arm. Not to pull it down, just to hold it, to be a bridge between her and the thing he'd dragged in. And he talked to her fast and low, and I caught my own soft-wrong name in the middle of all those words I couldn't follow. And I understood he was telling her this is the well man. This is the one who made the yoke. This is the one who saves the beef for you and the baby. He is not the other kind. And I watched the old woman not believe him, and go on not believing him, and then look past him at me with her knife still up, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I got down off the mule slow, and I took the cedar doctoring box, and I set it on the ground, and I stepped back away from it. And then I did it with the water skins, and the sack of meal, set each thing down in the dirt and stepped back, hands open, giving it all away before anyone asked, putting everything I'd brought on their side of the fire where she could reach it, and I couldn't. It's the oldest language there is, older than any words. I did not come to take. Look at my empty hands. She looked at my empty hands a long time. Then she said one word to Donna, and he went and pulled the blanket back off the small shape on the ground, and I saw the baby, and my stomach dropped straight through the hardpan. She was maybe 2. Fat-cheeked once, you could tell. A chubby, laughing thing not long ago, but the drought had gone to work on her, and now the skin was drawn tight over the little skull, and her lips had the same 3 cracks her brother's had, and her eyes were half open and gone dull, not seeing. And her breath came in a way I recognized, quick and shallow and dry, the body burning through the last of itself. Fever. Bad water somewhere, or no water long enough, or both. I put the back of my hand to her forehead, and it was like touching the side of a kettle. How long, I said, and then remembered they couldn't follow me, and I looked at Donna and I held up fingers 1 day. 2. And he held up 2 and then wavered his hand, more, maybe more. 2 days of this. 2 days of a baby cooking from the inside while an 8-year-old ran a relay to my well and back trying to carry enough water to put the fire out. And it wasn't the water, that was the thing. It was never going to be enough water carried in clay jars by a child. She needed more than water now. She needed the fever broken, and she needed it broken tonight. I'm not a doctor. I want that clear. I've pulled calves and I've sewn up men, and I set my own leg once with a fence rail and a lot of language, but I am not a doctor, and I knew, kneeling in that red dirt with my hand on that furnace of a child, that she was past what my cedar box could do. The laudanum would ease her. It wouldn't save her. What might save her might, I'm not even sure now, was a cool bath and clean water forced into her small by small all night long. And a fever tea I half remembered an old Mexican woman making, willow bark and something else. And more than any of that, it was time and shade and water without limit, none of which existed in a rock hollow 4 miles from the nearest wet hole. And here is where the heavy thing came, the decision I've turned over 10,000 times. There was water without limit. There was shade, real shade, thick adobe walls 3 feet deep that held the cool of the night straight through the killing hours of the day. There was a bed. There was everything that baby needed to have a fighting chance. It was at my house. And to get her there, I would have to load a dying Apache child onto a mule and walk her 4 miles back across open country in the daylight, straight past the mouth of the valley where Harlan Voss ran his cattle and his mouth and his men. And if he saw me, if any of them saw me bringing an Apache family down out of the hills to my ranch, I would not be a rancher anymore. I'd be a man who watered Apache, harbored them. And in that country, that year, that was a thing that got your barn burned at the least and got you shot across your own threshold at the worst. And got them worse than that, always worse. Whatever happened to me would be gentle next to what happened to them. So the sum was this. Leave the baby here in the safe hidden place, where she would almost certainly die, but where the family stayed hidden. Or take the baby to water and shade and a chance, and by doing it drag all 3 of them out of hiding and into the sightline of the worst men in the county. Safety and death on one side, a chance and terrible risk on the other. I knelt there and I could not make it. That's the truth. I, the grown man, the one who was supposed to know things, I knelt in the dirt with my hand on the child, and I could not make the sum come out, and I looked up. I don't know why, some animal instinct to find another set of eyes, and I looked up at the old woman. And she'd already made it. She was looking down at me, and she'd already done the arithmetic that I couldn't do, and I watched her do the last of it, watched her weigh 40 years of good reasons to never trust a white man against one small chance for the last baby of her blood, and I watched her set the whole weight of her own life's caution down in the dirt next to my empty hands. She said something to Donna without taking her eyes off me, and Donna turned to me, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and he said, "She says, take her, take little one to your water. I have been given things in my life. I've been loved, some, and forgiven more than I deserved, and handed responsibilities I didn't earn. Nothing has ever landed on me as heavy as that old woman deciding to trust me with the last of what she had. She was not naive. She knew every part of the risk better than I did. She'd lived the risk her whole life while I'd only heard about it. And she looked at it all and she picked the chance. And she picked me to be the chance. And I would rather have carried those 2 clay jars 2 miles on my own raw shoulders every day for a year than be trusted like that again. Because being trusted like that shows you exactly the size of the thing you might break. We wrapped the baby. The grandmother did it quick, sure hands, folding the blanket in a way that would hold the small body against a rider without smothering her. And while she did it, she talked, low, steady, not to me, to the baby, a running murmur of a language older than the rock, and I understood she was telling the child to hold on, or telling herself, or saying the things you say when you hand your heart to a stranger and watch him ride off with it. Here's the piece I didn't expect. When it came time to go, I reached for the baby, figuring I'd carry her, being the biggest, the strongest, and the grandmother pulled her back. And she put the baby into Donna's arms. And she looked at me and pointed at the boy and then at me, side by side, and I understood. The boy rides with his sister. You keep them together. Whatever your water does or doesn't do, the last thing this baby feels is her brother holding her, not a stranger. That was the one thing the old woman would not bend on, and it was right. And I have never forgotten it, that even in the middle of trusting me with everything, she made sure the love stayed in Apache hands, and I was only the mule that carried it. I put them both up on Gideon, Donna cradling the baby against his chest, and I took the lead rope and I walked. The grandmother would not come. Wouldn't leave the camp, I think, looking back. She stayed as the anchor, the one who'd still be hidden and safe if it all went wrong, the one thread they could pull the boy back to. Or maybe she just couldn't watch. She stood at the mouth of that rock hollow with her bone knife hanging now loose and forgotten in her hand. And she watched us go. And she did not wave. And I did not look back after the first time, because a man can only carry so much down a mountain, and I was already at my limit. 4 miles. Downhill this time, which sounds easier and wasn't, because downhill loaded on loose rock is how a mule breaks a leg and a man breaks his neck, and I had a dying child up top, so I took every step of it like it might be the one that killed us. The sun came down. That was mercy, the long light going gold and then red, the heat breaking its grip a degree at a time. Donna didn't say a word the whole way. He watched his sister's face, and he wet her cracked lips from the water skin, small by small, patient as ever, and once, only once, I heard him make a sound, a small caught sound, when the baby's breathing hitched and skipped, and he thought, for a second, it had stopped. It hadn't, but I heard what was in that sound, and I walked faster. We came down out of the broken country into the wash as the last light went, and that's where I made my mistake, the one that nearly cost everything. The one I should have seen coming and didn't, because I was watching the baby and the footing, and not the horizon like a man in that country learns too. There were riders at the mouth of the wash. 3 of them sitting their horses easy against the dying light, and I knew the shape of the man in front before I could see his face, knew it by the set of his shoulders and the way his horse stood, and my whole gut went to ice. Harlan Voss, and 2 of his. They'd been running strays, most like. And now here they were between me and my own ranch, and behind me was open ground I couldn't cross fast with a mule and 2 children, and beside me was a boy holding a dying Apache baby in plain sight, and there was no story in the world I could tell that would make what Voss was looking at into anything other than exactly what it was. Voss walked his horse forward a few steps. He had a way of tilting his head when he was about to enjoy something. He tilted it now. "Well," he said, and he let it hang there in the dusk, that one word, the way a man does when he's got all the time in the world and he knows you've got none. "Well, now, what have you gone and dragged down out of the rocks?" "I did the thing you're not supposed to do. I told the truth." "Not all of it, but the dangerous part." I told him the dangerous part, and I've never been fully able to explain why, except that I'd spent a whole life lying small lies to small men to keep the peace. And I was tired, and there was a dying child on my mule, and some door in me had already come off its hinges back in that rock hollow when the old woman set her caution down in the dirt. So when Harlan Voss tilted his head and asked me what I'd dragged down out of the rocks, I didn't reach for a story. I reached for nothing. I just stood there in the bottom of the wash with the lead rope in my hand, and I said, "A sick baby and her brother. I'm taking them to my well." The silence after that had a weight to it. I could hear Gideon's tail switch. I could hear, very small and very close, the dry hitch of the baby's breathing, and I prayed to whatever was listening that Voss couldn't hear it too, because a man deciding whether to be cruel does it worse when he can hear how easy the cruelty would be. Voss looked at me a long moment, then he looked at the boy. Then he looked at the small wrapped shape in the boy's arms, and I watched him understand exactly what it was, and I watched something move behind his face, and here is a thing I have had to make room for over the years, a thing that ruined the simple version of this story I used to like to tell. It wasn't triumph that moved behind Harlan Voss's face. It wasn't even meanness, not right then. It was calculation, cold and quick, a man adding up what this cost him and what it bought him, and I realized with a lurch that Voss wasn't standing there deciding whether to be a devil. He was deciding whether it was worth his while, and that's worse. A devil you can hate clean. A man doing sums about your life is a harder thing to look at. "You know what people'll say," Voss said at last. Conversational, almost gentle. "You know what I'll have to say, come to it. Man waters a pash, next thing they're camped on his creek, next thing they're driving off his neighbor's stock. That's how it goes. Everybody knows how it goes." "Maybe," I said. "Ain't no maybe about it." He shifted in his saddle, and his hand moved not to his gun, just to rest on his thigh near it, which in that country was its own kind of sentence. And the 2 men behind him shifted with him the way a shadow shifts when the thing that casts it moves. "You put that child back where you found it," Voss said, "and you ride on home and we forget we crossed trails tonight. That's a fair offer. That's better than fair." And there it was. The heavy thing again, because it was a fair offer in the arithmetic of that place and that year. Put the baby back and I keep my ranch, my standing, my skin. Everybody forgets. The boy goes home carrying his sister to die in the safe, hidden dark, the way she was always meant to, and I go back to whittling coyotes at my table, and I live to be an old man who once did a hard thing and thought better of it, and I tell myself for 40 years that it wasn't my fight. It was never my fight. They weren't mine. I looked at Donna. He was looking at me, not begging. I want that on the record too, same as the first day. Even here, even now, with everything hanging on it, that boy would not beg me. He just looked at me with the baby held against his chest, and his face all the way open the way it had been when he ran to my well, every wall down. And I understood that he'd already grasped the whole shape of the offer, quick as he grasped everything, and that he knew there was a version of the next minute where the grown men made their deal over his head, and he carried his sister back up the mountain to bury her. He knew. And he looked at me anyway, not to beg, to see, to find out one more time exactly what kind of man I was, the same flat-level waiting look he'd given me over the barrel of my own rifle 2 months before, when I was still deciding whether he was a puzzle or a person. I'd had my answer to that for a while. I just hadn't said it out loud to anybody, least of all myself. I said it to Harlan Voss. No, I said. He blinked. I don't think he'd expected it. I don't think in all his sums he'd carried the possibility that a man would just say no with no story behind it, no angle, no play. No, I said again, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to. I'm not putting her back. She's going to my well. And you can do whatever you're going to do about that, Harlan, but you're going to have to do it because I'm not going to hand her to you to make it easy. For a second, nobody moved. Then one of the men behind Voss, younger, I saw now, a kid himself really, couldn't have been 20, that young one said, "Quiet, Harlan. It's a baby." And Voss's head turned a half-inch toward him, and in that half-inch I saw the whole thing come apart for Voss, because a man can burn a barn in the dark with 3 men who all agree, but he cannot do it clean when one of his own says it's a baby out loud in the last light where everybody can hear it. The word hung there, baby. You can't unhear a thing like that. It changes the arithmetic for everybody in earshot, and Voss knew it, and I watched him know it. He sat his horse a moment longer. Then he gathered his reins, and his jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, and he said to me, but pitched for his men, saving what he could of himself, "This is on you. Whatever comes of it, it's on your head, not mine. I never saw a thing tonight." And he reined around hard, and he rode off up the wash, and the 2 men went after him, and the young one looked back once at the boy and the baby, and then he was gone too into the dark. I stood there and shook. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. Once they were out of sight, my knees near gave, and I had to hang onto the pack frame, and Donna reached down with his free hand and gripped my shoulder, the way I'd gripped nothing for him, but he'd learned it was a thing you did, and we held onto each other in the bottom of that wash for a second, a shaking old white man and an Apache boy with a dying baby. And then I said, come on, we're close, and we went the last mile home in the dark. I won't drag you through the night. It was long and it was ugly, and there were hours I was sure we'd lost her. I put her in the deep cool of the house on my own bed, and I did the things I half remembered, the willow bark boiled bitter, the water forced in small by small all night, Donna doing most of it because she'd take it from her brother when she fought me. The cool cloths changed and changed and changed as the fever cooked them warm. Around the blackest part of the night, that hour when everything sick gets worse, her breathing went so shallow I put my ear right down against her chest and could not, for a stretch of seconds that took a year each, hear anything at all. And Donna made that caught sound again, the one from the mountain, and I said no out loud to the dark like I'd said it to Voss, like the word had power, like a man could just refuse, and then she coughed. Small and dry and awful. But a cough is the body still arguing, and I sat back and I found I was crying, which I hadn't done since the fever winter, since my wife, and I let the boy see me do it, and I didn't care. She broke near dawn. I've seen fevers break. It's not gentle in the movies of the mind people carry. It's a hard thing, a sweat that soaks the bedding through, a shudder that runs the whole small body. But under it when it passed, her skin came down off the kettle heat by degrees, and her breathing went from that dry, quick flutter into something slower, deeper, a sleeping breath. And around the time the light came gray in the window, she opened her eyes, and they were seeing eyes again, dull, tired but present, and they went straight to Donna, and her cracked lips moved, and she said a word. Just one. His name, I think, or the baby version of it. And Donna put his forehead down against hers and stayed like that a long while, and his shoulders shook, and I got up quiet and went outside so he could have it to himself. That moment, because it was his, it had always been his. I was only ever the mule that carried the water. I stood out in the gray dawn by my well, and I got the cottonwood out of my pocket and my knife, and my hands did their thing without asking me, and this time I let them. And I didn't look to see what they were making until the sun was full up. It was the boy, small as my thumb. Straight-backed, carrying something on his back, I'd started the 2 jars before I even knew I was doing it. They stayed 11 days. Long enough for the baby to come all the way back, to get fat-cheeked again, to laugh once, a real laugh, at Gideon flapping his lip. And I tell you that Mule's foolish lip was worth every hard mile for the sound it pulled out of that child. The grandmother came down on the 4th day. Donna went and fetched her once he trusted it was safe, and she walked into my house like a queen inspecting a borrowed country, suspicious of every corner. And she never did fully warm to me. Why would she? A lifetime doesn't turn on 11 days. But on the last morning she took my hand in both of her old dry ones and she looked at me and she said, in careful broken English she must have hoarded from somewhere and saved for exactly this. You are not the other kind. And then she let go and would not look at me again, because I think it had cost her more to say than her knife arm had cost her that first night in the camp. They couldn't stay, of course. We both knew it. Voss had ridden off, but Voss had also said this is on your head, and men like Voss keep accounts, and the county was the county. An Apache family could not live at a white rancher's well in that year without it ending in fire, sooner or later, for all of us. So on the 12th morning I loaded Gideon with everything I could spare, meal, and the good clay jars filled, and the padded yoke, and my second-best knife pressed into Donna's hands over his objecting, and the cedar doctoring box entire, because they'd need it worse than me. And I took them not back to the rock hollow, but north, 3 days north, up to where the reservation land started and a body could at least be counted, be somewhere the killing was slower and had rules to it. It wasn't a good place. I won't pretend to you it was a good place. But it was better than a hole in the rocks, and it was the best thing my whole life had left me able to give. On the last morning before we split, them going on north with a Pima freighter I trusted, me turning back south to my empty ranch, Donna came and stood in front of me. Straight-backed. Flat, level, waiting look, the same as the very first day over the rifle barrel, and I understood he was giving it to me on purpose, that look, so I'd remember how we started against how we'd ended. He didn't say thank you. He never did the whole time, and I've come to be glad of it because you would have made it a debt, a transaction, the water for sugar arithmetic of strangers, and what we had wasn't that. Instead, he reached inside his shirt, and he took out a small thing and he put it in my hand and folded my fingers over it, the way I'd folded his over the knife. And then he turned and climbed up beside his grandmother and his sister and the freight. And he did not look back, because I'd taught him that, or the land had, that you don't look back going down a mountain. And I stood in the road and watched them go north until the dust took them, and then a while after that when there was nothing left to watch. The thing in my hand was a jar. A clay olla small as my thumb he'd made it, or the grandmother had helped him. Out of the pitch-lined clay they carried water in, fired hard, no bigger than the wooden ones I whittled. Round-bellied, perfect. The exact twin, near enough, of the first thing my own hands had carved the night he first told me his name. The little jar I'd set down like it burned me, and then kept anyway on the shelf by my bed. I keep them together now, the one he made me and the one I made that night. Side by side on the shelf, an Apache boy's clay and an old white man's cottonwood, 2 little jars that between them held 2 miles of walking and 1 dying baby and 1 word from Harlan Voss's young writer, and 1 old woman setting down her whole life's caution in the red dirt, the whole of it, in 2 things you could close your fist around. People still ask me about it, the ones who have heard some version. They always want to know the same thing. They want to know, did I ever see him again? Did the boy come back? What happened to him, to the sister, to all of them out there in the world I'd sent them into? And I tell them the truth, which is that I don't know. A letter came once, years on, in a hand that wasn't his, somebody writing for him, and it said only a few things, that they were alive, that the sister was grown, that he remembered the well. It didn't say where. I think that was on purpose. I think he was still being careful, still keeping the last wall up, protecting them the way he'd protected that camp the first day when he shook his head at my offer to ride out. He'd learned young that the safest gift you can give somebody who loves you is your absence, and he never unlearned it, and I have had to make my peace with loving a boy who was right to keep himself hidden from me. So no, I never saw him again. I want to give you the ending where the man rides up years later grown and whole and we clasp hands in the sun, and I can't, because it didn't happen, and I promised you at the start I'd tell it true.